Hi, everyone. It's Jean Sachs, the CEO from Living Beyond Breast Cancer. Today, we are talking to Dr. Stephen Pergam, Associate Professor of the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Division and Clinical Research Division at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. Very, very popular person right now, I'm sure. Welcome, Dr. Pergam.
Good to see you all again.
We had the honor of speaking to him a few weeks ago, but we wanted to bring him back because things have continued to change. So we want to touch base on what's new and what's different. And certainly the approval of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as well as the awareness of some new variants. So we will touch on all these things.
Yeah.
So let's just start with, can you explain the difference between Pfizer, Moderna, and the newly approved Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Yeah, so let's start with Pfizer and Moderna. They're pretty similar. There's a proprietary piece that surrounds what's called the mRNA. So it's the messenger RNA that is surrounded by a lipid, sort of a fat portion, where it's injected into your arm, is basically taken in by the cell. That messenger RNA is it's like a piece of code that tells the cell to make this a type of protein, which is that spike protein, that's the coronavirus protein, that then it puts on the surface of the cell, and then the immune system responds to that and develops an immune response. So it's a really clever way of using a piece of machinery that's pretty common for use in sort of the body all the time to sort of do this. And it's nice because that message goes in and then it fades away, it disappears. So it's almost like an email message with a warning that tells everyone this is bad news. And then that warning actually goes from those immune cells, is transferred to lymph nodes in your arm and then other portions of your body. So it's kind of like a wanted poster that it continually spreads throughout your body to tell people that you should be on the lookout for this. So your body is then prepared for a potential exposure. So mRNA vaccines are pretty similar. They each have an effectiveness, vaccine effectiveness about 95%.
Before we move on to Johnson & Johnson,
sure.
So there's a lot of rumors going around that the Pfizer vaccine has fewer side effects than the Moderna.
Yeah.
Is that true? And if so, why, if they're so similar?
Yeah, it's always hard to say. There's always slight differences. I would say there's been a little bit more associated sort of rash that's been occasional in patients at the site of in fact, the site of injection for Moderna. I think it's really hard to say if there's really that much difference. I think it's a little bit of nuance. I would not suggest that you choose based on that concern. I continually remind people, whatever vaccine's available, you should get it. So I wouldn't try to target one versus the other specifically for that reason. I think there may be subtle differences, and it may be depending on the person and their immune response to those components that make up that particular vaccine. But I really don't think there's a massive difference between the two.
Right. That's helpful because I think there's, again, it depends on who you talk to. And then the other thing I just want to ask before we get on to the Johnson & Johnson is, some people have been saying, don't take Tylenol or Advil if you before you get the shot or in the first day or two. Is that in fact true?
Yeah, the way I look at it, there is data in animal models that if you take ibuprofen or Advil, Aleve, any of the what are called NSAIDs or nonsteroidal and inflammatory drugs, that they can actually decrease some aspects of the immune system, your response, and might actually have a slight decrease in your response. Now, again, this animal models, not in human trials. People that are on chronic drugs like that, they use them all the time. It doesn't matter. You should continue to take those if they're prescribed for you for a specific reason. But if you can avoid taking something like Advil or something like that, it's probably okay to avoid it. I usually try to encourage people, if they're going to use something, to use Tylenol, because I think it probably has less of an effect on the immune system. But if you're really feeling terrible, it's not going to make a huge difference in your immune responses. So it's okay to take a dose.
Okay, that's great. I love getting those questions answered. So tell us about Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah, so Johnson & Johnson is a different vaccine. And what's kind of cool about that vaccine is it's not brand new. So this is what's called an adenovirus vector vaccine. So it's adenovirus 26. It's a subtype of multiple different adenoviruses that are out there, which is not common in the human population. We just don't see a lot of people who get it. So it's a brand new virus. You don't have an immune response when you get it injected. The virus has been modified. So 2 portions of the virus have been clipped out so that the virus doesn't have the ability to replicate in you. So really, it's providing this opportunity for the virus to infect a cell, but then it can't replicate itself. So there's no danger of you getting infected. So it's safe for immunosuppressed patients to get it. And what they do is they modify that as well to put a similar cartridge in there, which is an mRNA protein. And instead of having this sort of fat around it, which delivers it to the cell, this is a separate situation where the virus enters the cell and delivers that same particle. And then it is reproduced by the cell, and the similar process goes through. So it's a different way to provide that information to the cell. It's just a different way to respond. And so the adenovirus vaccines have been used, actually. The Ad26 vaccine, these viral vector vaccines, have been used previously for the Ebola vaccines, which are used in Africa. And so they've been approved through the WHO to be used there. And they use a similar aspect. Now, one advantage in the study that was organized nationally for Johnson & Johnson is it's a one-time dose. So that's a big advantage in terms of the general public getting vaccinated. I think one challenge in immunosuppressed patients that we don't know is people ask me all the time, which one is better? And frankly, I just can't answer that question. If you look at the data, one thing that's hard in comparisons is people would say, well, Johnson & Johnson is 65% effective or 70% effective. It's not quite as good. Well, if you looked at a single dose of Moderna or a single dose of the Pfizer vaccine, it's probably around the same range in its effectiveness in preventing COVID-19, at least in what we could tell in the early data in the first few weeks before that second dose was given. So it may be that a second dose of Johnson & Johnson may be more beneficial in the long term, but that's not how the original study was organized. They are doing an additional trial, which is a follow-up to the primary trial, to look at a second dose of Johnson & Johnson to see if it's better. But in the short term, one dose is quite effective. And what's really important is when people keep talking about this is they're both really effective at preventing serious complications from COVID, meaning hospitalization and death, which is really what we all care about. Now, there may be a little more that you may develop symptomatic COVID with one dose Johnson & Johnson. But part of what's challenging when you look at these trials is when the Moderna and Pfizer trials were being run, there was just less disease. We just didn't see as much COVID in the community. When Johnson & Johnson was run, it was run during a period when there was much more COVID. And they really focused in areas where there were more of the variants. So when you looked at Johnson & Johnson, they targeted parts of the world that were specifically where those variants were. So South Africa and Brazil were 2 locations where they did additional enrollment to make sure that they evaluated that more carefully. So I think that was important to realize, is that the risk of getting COVID was higher, potentially because there was just more around when the Johnson & Johnson study was happening. So it may not be a fair comparison. And to be clear, there is no head-to-head comparison between Moderna and Johnson & Johnson to say one is better than the other. So I say this all the time, is don't look at that percentage to say which one should I get because it says 65 versus 95. It really doesn't matter. They're very good vaccines, and they're not comparable because it's a 1-dose vaccine versus a 2-dose vaccine, and we just don't know how to make those comparisons. Right. So I think it's key to sort of remember that any vaccine that's available is still kind of hard for some patients to get vaccinated. So if you can get vaccinated, get whatever vaccine is available for you.
Okay. It's helpful for you to state again that it's how the studies were designed, and that's how we learned and will continue to learn as we do more. What about the sort of protection you get? We've been told with Pfizer and Moderna, it's about 2 weeks after your second dose that you can feel like you have the maximum protection. Is Johnson & Johnson longer? I've heard it's 4 weeks, but what do you have to share about that?
Yeah, it's about 4 weeks. So actually it's a shorter time frame if you think about it, because Moderna is 28 days in between first and second dose. An additional 2 weeks would be 6 weeks. With Pfizer, it's 3 weeks plus 2 weeks is 5 weeks, and with Johnson & Johnson, it's 4 weeks. So slight
Why are
differences.
people confused? It
Yeah,
makes
it's
no
exactly,
sense.
exactly. So I think the key piece is that once you've been vaccinated, somewhere around 2 weeks after your second dose for Moderna and Pfizer, you're protected, and 4 weeks after the Johnson & Johnson is basically when you should feel like you're going to get the maximal protection that you're going to get.
Okay. All
Mhm.
right. That's helpful. And yes, it is still hard to get this vaccine. And we
Mhm.
certainly have been hearing about the frustration about what's happening just depending where you live and what the
Mhm.
priority areas are. So having the Johnson & Johnson, do you think that's going to help accelerate
I
the
do.
accessibility?
I do. Anytime you have a vaccine that can be given as a single dose vaccine, one of the major advantages is you can vaccinate a large population very quickly. If you think about it, for every Moderna dose that's created or every Pfizer dose that's created, it only covers 50% of a person because you have to have 2 doses.
Yeah.
And I really encourage people, single doses for cancer patients, we really want them to get both doses.
Yeah.
There are early indications, in some reports that are coming out, and something we expected is cancer patients are not going to have generally as robust a response to these vaccines as the general public because they are on immunosuppressive therapy and they don't necessarily respond as well to vaccines. So getting that second dose is really important for the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. And then in terms of Johnson & Johnson, we're not sure what that's going to do. We'll find out more data about that as time goes on. But I think what's important is that, again, if we're not sort of making an effort to get people vaccinated, we're going to lose some traction. So I think one advantage with Johnson & Johnson is because it's easy, you can go into communities and vaccinate a lot more people very quickly. And you don't have to go back and do that second dose. So I think we're going to see more and more vaccines. And so the more they produce, the more total number of people they can vaccinate with that single dose vaccine. So anytime you're bringing in more vaccine candidates, it's great. And there are additional ones that are potentially coming down the pike. There is a vaccine called by a company called Novavax, which is another technology, which is a protein-based vaccine with an adjuvant. And an adjuvant is something where it increases your immune response. And it's very much like Shingrix, which is the zoster vaccine. It's a similar kind of process. And that vaccine actually in trials looks also quite good and could be something that comes up relatively soon too. So I think having more of these choices and having more products being made is only going to be an advantage for more access for people in our community.
Great. And what about these new variants? Are you feeling confident that these vaccines we've been talking about will be protective?
Yeah, so I think, Johnson & Johnson studied this pretty closely in South Africa. They saw a decreased response to the South African strain, but they were quite good. And I actually asked the Johnson & Johnson representatives in an FDA meeting about this specifically. And, I think the response is less. Your antibody, flexibility is a little less with the South African variant strain, but it still prevented major complications like hospitalization and death. So that's important. From the UK strain, or the B117 strain, it also looks to be quite effective. It's a little bit harder because, Moderna and Pfizer were done prior to these variants being present. And so it's a little bit more difficult to sort of, in a trial design, evaluate this. But the early data that they have, they've been able to take these viral strains and put them with, what we call sera or blood serum from people that have been vaccinated and demonstrate that the vaccinated patient's blood and that antibodies that are present can neutralize those variants. So it does look as though they're also effective. There's also what's called I think it's a P2 variant. I can't remember if it's P1 or P2 from Brazil. That's also concerning for some changes. And so far, the data also looks as though they're effective against those. I think the one vaccine that's out there that maybe doesn't look quite as good is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not approved in the United States, so it's not available now. Doesn't look like it works as well against that South African strain. And so that's been one slight variance. in terms of the different viral strains. But I would imagine we're going to continue to see these new viral strains come up, and I sort of have this sense that it's going to feel like flu, where we're going to need a slight variant change. But what's really cool is Moderna is already doing a trial using a new cassette, a new mRNA that will create a different spike protein that targets that variant from South Africa. So there's already the ability to make changes in these vaccines to see how it might work. And so they're doing that current trial right now to see if that might be a better and more effective vaccine approach, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I mean, they literally can just change that out. So that sort of process will be important as time goes on, as new variants emerge.
Okay. So I know the CDC, I think it was last week, came out with some guidelines about, what vaccinated people can do. So I think it would be great for you to just share, for those of us that have been lucky enough to get vaccinated, or those that are waiting or in the middle of getting vaccinated, what is the appropriate protocol?
Yeah. So I think one thing you always have to keep in mind when you're looking at CDC guidance is really focused on the general public. When you're a cancer patient, particularly patients on active treatment, we don't really know how well these vaccines are going to work. And as I said, I'm a little concerned that the early responses have been less than as robust as they've been in the general public. And if that's true, you need to be cautious that maybe you may not respond as well. There was a recent publication in JAMA, a research letter on solid organ transplant recipients who were vaccinated, that showed there was only about a 17% response rate after the first dose of the vaccine, which is probably about a third of the response rates than the general public after that first dose of vaccine for Pfizer and Moderna. And if that's true, it means that there are some patients that are not going to develop an appropriate response and are not going to be fully protected from these vaccines because of levels of immune suppression or other aspects. Since we can't really determine exactly who those people are all the time, and antibody testing, I will just say, is a little bit messy, and we're trying to clarify that. So I wouldn't recommend getting post-vaccine antibodies at this point. And the National Comprehensive Cancer Center Network basically just updated our guidelines to avoid getting antibodies because of the challenges around that. But what we think is that if you're not going to have as robust of an immune response post-vaccine, which is what we'd assume, we still want people to be cautious. What that means is continuing to mask in public, continuing to wash your hands, continuing to be somewhat socially distant if possible. Obviously it's impossible to not go to the pharmacy. If you need to go to the grocery store and pick up things as usual, those are probably things that are okay to do. You can still go see your clinic. You can still do the things you want to do. But just thinking in mind, just being cautious that now that you're vaccinated does not mean that you can meet in large groups. It doesn't mean you should invite people over who are involved in high-risk activities. You need to be thinking about the fact that you still are at risk for getting COVID, and you still should be cautious. Until we have more information about the efficacy of these vaccines in cancer patients, I encourage you to be quite cautious and to remain steadfast in all of the things that you're doing. I'm still wearing a mask when I go out in public. I am still avoiding coming to work except for today because I had to see clinic patients. I'm doing a lot of Zoom calls and continuing to do a lot of distance work because I still don't want to get exposed to COVID, although I've been vaccinated. So these are important key issues I really want patients to be aware of. That guidance from the CDC is not for all of you. It's not for cancer patients. It's for the general public.
So one clarification, when you say cancer patients, are you specifically referring to those that are actively in treatment?
Yeah, great
What
question.
about those that might be on hormonal therapy or are longer term? Because I think there's confusion.
Yeah, sure. I think it's always hard to know. So somebody who's had a hematologic malignancy, like a bone marrow transplant patient, we assume that their immune responses are probably not going to be exactly the same for years beyond. So I would say I put them in the category to still be in a high risk category and to continue to do that social distancing. Patients undergoing active treatment, or those about to start on active treatment, or those who've just completed active treatment with chemotherapy or radiation, I would say be cautious and continue to do these guidelines. I think somebody who's 2 to 3 years post therapy, who's doing great, who's just in monitoring once a year or maybe every 6 months with their oncologist, much less risk, and I think you can be a little more more, you don't have to be quite as cautious. I would say somebody on just hormonal therapy, certainly the risk is less. But I always encourage you to talk to your physician, talk to your oncologist and say, what is my immune suppression level? Should I be worried about this? And talk through that conversation, because cancer patients are very diverse and the treatments they're on are quite unique. And you may not realize that you're on something that decreases your immune system because you only take it once a month, or you take it every day and think, oh, this is no big deal, but it actually may increase your risk a little bit. So it's important to have those conversations with your provider. And I think as time goes on, we're going to know more about subgroups, like a patient with multiple myeloma versus a patient with breast cancer. We're going to learn the differences between how well somebody with a GI cancer on a particular therapy does versus somebody who has CLL who's getting a drug called ibrutinib. So all of these kind of things will start to play out as we get more information, as more people get vaccinated.
Right. And then just one more question.
Yeah.
So what about surgery? I have heard when you have
Yep.
surgery, that can reduce your immune system. So what about those people?
Yeah, so what we typically recommend for two reasons. I would say if you're about to have surgery, I would not get surgery, I would not get your vaccine right before you go to surgery, like the day beforehand, because if you develop a fever, it might make it so the surgeons don't want to do the procedure. It might delay your surgery. Or if you have other symptoms that come with that vaccine, not ideal to do that. And then somewhere around a week to 2 weeks after your surgery, you're oftentimes recovering, you're not feeling great. Probably not a perfect time. So I would do it somewhere around, 10 days to 2 weeks after your surgery is a good time to consider doing it. I would just say really important, Jean, to also comment how important it is to talk to family members, close contacts, and caregivers that work with you as a cancer patient. One of the best ways you can protect yourself is to make sure that everyone around you is vaccinated. So we know that one of the best ways to get infected with COVID-19 is to get infected from somebody in your household, because you can't socially distance. You can't wear a mask all day in your house. And so to comment to them to be cautious about how they live their lives, and then, to be socially distancing, masking, all that stuff until they can get vaccinated, and to get vaccinated as soon as they can, because that will decrease your risk for potentially getting COVID and getting really sick from it. So another way to protect yourself if you know the vaccine responses are not going to be as good.
Right. And I think that's what's been frustrating for a lot of us, because caregivers aren't a prioritized group. And I think that it is frustrating that, they have to wait. So
I would say many of us have been advocating, not locally, on national levels, to push this narrative. It's just hard when there's not enough vaccine to get those folks done. One other important comment I do want to make that's relevant to the breast cancer community, and this may be something that you're going to sort of review, but is about lymphadenopathy. So patients who get particularly Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, one of the side effects can be lymph node enlargement. So you can get some lymph nodes under your arm on the site where you get vaccinated. And there's been a couple of reports where people have breast cancer and then identify these lymph nodes, and there's been concern for spread of cancer, because that's oftentimes a location where they go. So make sure that if you get vaccinated, talk to your doctor about it. If you do develop big lymph nodes, they know that you got the vaccine. Or if you're about to get a scan to determine how you're progressing in your disease pattern, make sure that you're not doing it right after you get your vaccine, because if those lymph nodes are a little bit swollen, sometimes it can make people worry. And so the recent guidance from the NCCN was to delay those scans for 4 to 6 weeks if possible, to avoid any potential complications after vaccination.
Yeah, that is important. And we have been talking about that. So I think the key takeaways that I have gotten is whatever vaccine you can get it. Make sure your close friends and family get vaccinated, and still maintain social distancing and being as careful as possible. And we're still learning. So let's just close by, I know I just got my first vaccine yesterday, and I was told to go online and register and report side effects. So is that something everybody should be doing?
Yeah, so there's two things you can do. So for sort of mild side effects, there's something called V-Safe. And V-Safe is pretty cool. I did it. You'll get it as a sheet when you sign in for your vaccine, and there's usually a little SKU card you can sort of take a picture of, and it can send you directly to a link. You can actually use it on your camera. If you put your camera on it, it will automatically pull up that website and go to it and register. It's a CDC link that basically, about 6 hours after you get your vaccine, they'll send you a text message with a link that you go on, and then you fill out your particular side effects. How are you feeling, etc. And then they do daily for the first week, and then weekly for I think the next month. And then it's like at 3 months and at 6 months after your vaccine, just to track and see how you're doing. And that's basic, minor side effects like arm soreness, some chills that you might have. If you have fever, how are you feeling? How's it affected your daily activities? It's pretty easy to do, and it's really convenient because it's this instant reminder you can just click on and answer. There's another way to report symptoms. Let's say you got a vaccine and you had, some really weird manifestation. You've heard about people developing something called Bell's palsy, where you get a weakness on one side of your face. Additional data has not suggested there's any link between the vaccines and that particular complication. So you don't have to worry about that complication. But let's say you did develop it. On the back side of your vaccine card, there's something called VAERS. It's VAERS. You can go to that website and actually report any sort of strange symptom that might come up that's unique or different for you. Something that's more severe that maybe required hospitalization or an evaluation by a physician. Those are also important to capture because sometimes those early reports can suggest something that's new. Now, we haven't heard any new reports about this or concerns, but as an example, there's been some reports about AstraZeneca in Europe, in Germany, France, and a few other and the Netherlands. They have stopped giving the AstraZeneca vaccine because of some concern about potential link to blood clots, as an example. Now, I haven't seen the data. I don't know why they are making this recommendation, and it's not a vaccine you can get here, but that may be through some of those reporting mechanisms. So they can be really helpful in identifying something that would otherwise not be expected. So those are the two reporting mechanisms that can be helpful. And again, if you're not sure how to do that and you have a weird symptom, talk to your physician and they can help you do that reporting too.
Right. Yeah. And then we're all adding to the data so that some of these myths then are at least backed up with data. So this has been so informative. Thank you so much. I feel like progress has been made since we spoke a few weeks ago, and I'm just hoping it continues. So we really appreciate your time. And I want to thank everyone for watching. And remember, Living Beyond Breast Cancer is always here for you. We have closed Facebook pages if you need immediate support, as well as the breast cancer helpline. So go to our website, lbbc.org, and please stay in touch.